I half slide, half spring out of my dusky umber car, setting off a minor avalanche in a layer of dog fur that permanently coats the interior. Its source streaks out after me a second later, a flash of mottled gray and tannellation. Iwi is instantly in her element. Her paws trace semicircles in the soil behind the car as she sniffs noisily in every direction. Impatient to take in the thousands of scents that swirl around and through each other in the pine-crisp air of the national forest. I'm as eager and buzzing with restless energy as she is. After weeks of planning, we're about to embark on our first multi-day hike since I relocated here to the Pacific Northwest. In my mind, the trip marks the end of the worst year and a half of my life. During those agonizing months, as I struggled to keep my head above water through anxiety over the bleak academic job market, and grief at the sudden, though not unexpected, death of my mother, my lifeline was imagining just this sort of excursion. Fantasies of slipping past a dense woodline and losing myself in the ancient loveliness of the evergreens consoled me when I finally conceded, fancy philosophy PhD notwithstanding, that there would be no career for me in academia, that at 32, I'd have to find something new to do with my life, and with no family to lend me a sense of rootedness through the transition. I toss my head lightly, brushing back the memories with a lock of hair that had fallen across my glasses. I shoulder my pack, give Iwi's ear a scratch, and head toward the quaint, old repurposed cabin that serves as the park's welcome center. Be back soon, the sign on the door promises in a cheery, hand-carved spruce. Odd. I must have stopped by this building at least a dozen times over the past couple of months on my way out to the trails for shorter hikes, and I've never seen it closed during daylight hours before. The corners of my smile slip a bit as I realize that means I'll have to forego my customary Saturday chat with Whit, who runs the center over the weekends. He and I quickly formed a compelling connection when I began to frequent the park. First over a mutual appreciation for its old-growth woods, and then as we got to know each other better, over the experience of coming out to our families in our mid-20s that we both share. For a moment, my mind is full of his warm mahogany eyes, crinkling at the corners as they do when he's about to deliver an unforgivable pun. Next time, I promise myself, I'll ask for his number next time I see him. Of course, I've made the same vow every weekend for the past 2 months. For now, though, the sun has been up nearly half an hour already, and I have a lot of ground to cover in order to reach my intended campsite by nightfall. The route I've planned is ambitious, especially for a novice hiker. A little shiver of nervous excitement slides down my spine and settles in my stomach as I remind myself of the consequences of falling short, a profoundly solitary night somewhere along the trail, away from the company and sense of security that an established campsite in a popular national forest offers. Better get going, I grin at Iwi. People exploring the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest for the first time often express surprise at just how quickly the feeling of being close to civilization gives way to the unmistakable sense that one is deep in the woods. Iwi and I have been walking for less than an hour now, no more than 2 miles or so beyond the trailhead, and I already feel it uncoiling itself at the base of my brainstem, the familiar conviction that I've wandered out of my species' territory. For me, the sensation was always served as a potent catalyst for aesthetic experience. It heightens my awareness of the otherness and ages-old unknowability of the place until the next forest undergoes a sort of chrysopia for me. Its beauty temporarily transmuted into sacredness in my perception, or, at any rate, the nearest thing to sacredness that a confirmed atheist can countenance. Absorbed in these thoughts, I don't notice at first that Iwi has dropped out of view. I turn around and find that she's standing about 5 yards behind me, rigid and perfectly still. She's staring intently into the trees bordering the path, with her head low and ears at stark attention. This portion of the trail winds along the side of a hill, the ground rising sharply to the right and sloping downward somewhat more gradually to the left. Yui is staring in the latter direction, into the dense tangle of ferns, foliage, and deadfall that veils the hill's descent. "Come on, Yui," I call. The words come out more softly than I intended, but my voice seems to cut through the quiet with a disconcerting sharpness. Like a peal of laughter during that moment at a party when every conversation has simultaneously reached a lull. She doesn't react. I walk a few paces back toward her, following her gaze in an effort to spot whatever has her so riveted. It's mid-October, and not yet uncommon for newly weaned fawns to wander closer than their mothers would have permitted to these heavily trafficked trails. Well, usually heavily trafficked. Today I haven't encountered anyone else since I arrived. My fingers brush absently against the canister of bear spray clipped to my belt loop, but I see nothing. A towhee calls brightly nearby, and all at once the tension in Iwi's body evaporates. She saunters up the path toward me and continues past, tail wagging. She is evidently ready to keep exploring. My pulse quickens abruptly, however, and I stay rooted to the spot several seconds longer, scanning the shadows beneath the pines, until the bird's call interposes itself between Iwi and the object of her attention. I hadn't noticed that the only sound I'd heard for at least 10 minutes had been the crunch of dry leaves under our feet. The next several hours of the hike pass peacefully and pleasantly, accompanied, with no further unsettling intermissions, by the usual music of the woods. Shortly before noon, we reach a stretch of trail that runs alongside a tidy, sunlit circular clearing for about 60 feet. Toward the clearing's distant edge, perhaps 45 or 50 feet from the path, is a small gray boulder, streaked with veins of basalt and bronze-colored minerals. "What do you think, girl?" I smile, giving Iwi's ear a satisfied tussle. "I'll bet that we could walk 100 miles and never find a nicer lunch spot." The trail is plainly visible from every part of the clearing, and so I don't pay it much attention when she declines to follow me into it in favor of stretching out on the shady, packed soil. Neither do I notice how the hazy sunlight that illuminates the clearing seems to be filtering through the surrounding trees, but not from any particular direction, and certainly not from directly overhead, as it should be at midday. The breeze whispers through the eucalyptus-hued carpet of ferns and tall grass. They bend and sway together in waves, rustling as they lap against the solitary stone island on which I'm now sitting. The effect is enticingly euphoric, and more than once I let my eyes drift closed for a moment as I nibble at my dried cranberries and nuts. I rest in the clearing this way for perhaps 20 minutes before rejoining Yui on the trail. 20 minutes and no longer. My first indication that something is wrong follows swiftly after. Yui and I have barely resumed walking when I pull up my phone to consult the hiking app on which my route is charted. I move to unlock the screen, but stop short, my thumb frozen on the home button. What the hell? This can't be right. The clock display reads 3:45 p.m. It couldn't be later than about 12:30. I swing my pack off my shoulder and fumble around inside it for a moment, eventually producing a wristwatch that I carry in case my phone dies on the trail. The charcoal numbers blink up at me, unsymptomatically. 3:46 p.m. Could I have fallen asleep in the clearing without being aware of it? For 3 hours? I can't imagine how, but no other explanation comes to mind. However studiously, I cast around for one. In any case, I have a more pressing problem. We're now hours behind schedule on a hike that was meant to take all day. Even if we were to push through the rest of the route with minimal breaks, there's no way that we would make it to the campsite before sunset. And for an inexperienced night hiker with no headlamp and an easily spooked dog, attempting to navigate the remainder of the distance in darkness would be risky at best. It seemed to me that I have two options at this point. Concede that Yui and I will be spending the night alone somewhere on the trail, or look for a shortcut. My nagging unease over the sense of having lost time makes the choice straightforward. I pull up the route on my phone and try to zoom in, but the app glitches immediately. So I resort to the massive fold-out map that Whit gave me on the third visit to the park. "Technology is great until it isn't," he quipped that day, a playful glint in his dark eyes. "And besides, paper is a closer relative to the forest than bits of metal and plastic. Maybe this will make you feel more at home." At home would have been an overstatement at this moment, but I feel a warm surge of relief rush outward from my abdomen as I spot a thin beige line on the map, branching off to the north, just a mile or so ahead of my location. The main trail winds circuitously along the side of a tall ridge of hills that form an elevated arc, a sort of horseshoe-shaped front porch, making the entrance to the eastern mountain range beyond. By contrast, the minor connecting path, whose course I'm now tracing with my finger, cuts directly across the thickly forested valley within the arc. It reconnects with the main trail on the opposite side, in serendipitously close proximity to the campsite. With any luck, we should make it before the shadows already seeping out from beneath the firs saturate the forest completely. Despite my keenness to reach the connecting path that cuts across the valley, I unwittingly walk past it entirely at first. So narrowly and sharply it splits off from the main trail. Fortunately, Yui alerts me to its presence. Just before the point at which it intersects the main trail from the north, she stops abruptly, retreating several paces towards the wall of earth and undergrowth that rises sharply from the trail's southern edge. She sits there stiffly, glancing between me and the break in the trees. Something in her demeanor invokes a memory from early this morning. The way she stopped short when I crossed the invisible fence encircling our yard, waiting for me to disable her receiver collar so that she could follow me across the boundary. The impression is fleeting. The late afternoon gloom of the forest is already deepening toward twilight, and I don't have time to entertain the uncanny products of my unsettled imagination. I crouch in front of her and scratch her ears with both hands. Catching sight of my face reflecting in her honey amber eyes, I look anxiously. "I think that we could both use a little company tonight, girl," I murmur. I straighten, adjusting my pack, and take a few steps down our new route. After a moment's hesitation, Yui follows. This connecting path runs perpendicular to the stretch of trail from which it branches off of, plunging directly down the face of the ridge and into the thickly forested valley below. The slope is steep, but not steep enough to be unmanageable, and I'm grateful to have gravity on our side for at least the first portion of our scramble toward the campsite. The narrowness of the path, on the other hand, is less amenable. Dense undergrowth and towering, moss-coated trees crowd in against it, so closely on either side that Yui and I have to walk in single file. Every few yards I find myself angling my shoulder to maneuver my unwieldy backpack through a patch of encroaching vegetation. The forest canopy nearly obscures the sky overhead here, with fist-sized flashes of periwinkle slipping through to serve as reminders of the dwindling daylight. I can hear the familiar woodland cacophony, birds and other fauna, rustling foliage, snapping tree limbs from every direction. But it strikes me as more distant than before. Even my own footsteps seem somehow far away. The realization gradually fades into focus, and my awareness that the sound is muffled here, as if the claustrophobic press of pine needles, leaves, and ferns were leaching vibrations from the air like mist, as if they were enforcing the sort of reverent stillness that benefits the ancient places of the earth. I I quickened my pace. After about 30 or 40 minutes of steady descent, I begin to look for the ground to level out at the base of the ridge, but it continues plunging downward at the same grade. After an hour, my calves are starting to burn with a prolonged plantar flexion, and at each moment, I'm thinking surely I must be at the bottom of the hill. After about an hour and a half, I know that something is seriously wrong. There is simply no way that I should still be losing elevation so sharply on a hill this size. I retrieve my compass from my backpack and check it every few meters as I proceed, confirming to myself that I really am heading due north down the slope. After 2 hours, the ragged shreds of sky visible through the branches are glowing icy lavender with the vestiges of day, and I know in my bones that I won't be getting off this ridge tonight. I press on, less out of any rational hope that I might reach the campsite than a need to outspace what my senses seem to be telling me. A compulsion deeper than instinct to distance myself from this incursion of the inexplicable into reality. And then the light is gone. The seeds of unease in my stomach sprout into outright fear, and I struggle to maintain my presence of mind through the altering surges of adrenaline and panic. I briefly entertain the possibility of turning around and trying to return to the main trail, but scrambling back up that incline in the starless blackness beneath the pines with no headlamp would be dangerous, even if I were confident with my location and bearing, which is quite evidently no longer the case. No, the safest option right now is to stay put until morning and try to retrace my steps with the advantage of daylight. I find a spot on the path where the gap between the flanking trees is just sufficient to admit my compact tent. I set it up with fumbling hands in the beam of my flashlight. Yui shows no interest in exploring any of the smells or sounds, the latter still unaccountably muffled, as if a thick wool hat was covering my ears around our hasty camp. She sits in the middle of the path, as close to me as she can, the tent between herself and the trail's downward course. As soon as the tent is up, we crawl inside and double zip the door. I'm grateful that the layer of canvas obscures my view of the rippling obsidian darkness outside, like a cat in a cardboard box. Being hemmed in closely on all sides by shelter makes me feel less vulnerable and exposed. Gradually, the adrenaline recedes, leaving me exhausted. I drift into a fitful sleep. I'm awakened not by any noise, but by the utter absence of it. The woods are enveloped in a dense, heavy silence, without even a breeze to make the intertwining branches whisper to each other in the dark. I feel as though I've been asleep for hours. I sit up in my sleeping bag, fumbling for my flashlight. As it clicks on, I barely manage to stifle the scream that claws its way up the back of my throat. The tent door is wide open. Yui is standing just inside it, motionless, eyes fixed on a point deep within the pitchy undergrowth. Against the abject, yawning soundlessness, it's impossible not to hear the sudden, soft rustling of pine needles and creaking branches in nearby trees, no more than 15 yards behind the tent. Yui's head snaps in that direction, but I'm frozen in place by the icy rush of terror that tears through my nervous system. A thud and a dry crush of detritus as whatever in the trees drops lightly to the forest floor. Snap, crunch, footsteps inching slowly closer in the dark. 2 feet, 2 legs, supporting something massive, now quickening its pace, now barreling at full tilt toward the tent with horrifying speed and purpose. "Yui, go!" I shout, and we both careen out of the tent into the impossible thickness of the night. I dart between pine trunks and tumble through shrubs, one arm raised to protect my face from whatever needles, twigs, and thorns ripping up my skin, and the other clasping my flashlight as if it were life itself. The only sounds are Yui's frenzied uphill plunges through the forest ahead and the steady, pounding footfalls of the thing behind, grotesquely unimpeded by the tangle of vegetation, closer every moment. A single coherent thought shakes itself loose from the paralyzing grip of fear that's coiled itself around my brain. I'm going to die here. Then all at once, I'm running through open air, and I can no longer hear either Yui or the thing from the pines. I skid to a halt, swinging my flashlight around wildly in the sudden silence. I've emerged into a clearing identical in every respect to the one that stole my hours earlier. Down to the solitary gray boulder with its basalt and bronze-colored veins. The ground here even appears level, while all its surrounding earth continues sharp descent down the ridge. I dash to the boulder and crouch behind it, partially hidden by the tall grass, lungs screaming with panic and exertion. There are no stars in the night sky overhead, but the darkness is not so oppressively heavy here beneath the trees. And the air is not so thick. I douse my flashlight and wait. I can't be sure how long I've been kneeling here in the grass, listening intently for any rustling or footsteps that might break the stillness of the clearing. It feels like just a few minutes, but my phone and watch are back in the tent, along with all my other supplies, save the flashlight and a few small items clipped to my belt loops. Once the roaring torrent of blood in my ears subsides, I carefully lower myself onto the moist soil so that I'm completely obscured by the surrounding vegetation. I begin to inch forward on my elbows and stomach towards the trees, the south edge of the clearing, probing the silence for any sign that Yui might still be there. The next indication that I'm not alone in these woods isn't a sound at all. However, it's a light. The clean, white beam of an LED headlamp moving methodically through the trees. An impulse to run blindly towards it grasps me by the base of the spine, but I manage to suppress it. I have no idea what that thing from the pines was, or what it might be capable of. And anyone who has ever heard a campfire story knows better than to follow lights into the woods. Then I hear my name, slipping between the trees, on the tones of a strained but familiar voice. James! James, are you out here? Try to make a noise if you can hear me. I'd know that voice anywhere. Whit! My voice breaks as I shout. I'm over here! Please! I switch on my flashlight and aim the beam across the clearing in his direction, leaping to my feet. Okay, I'm coming! Stay right there, James! I hear him clambering through the undergrowth, as the globe of cool light affixed to his forehead grows steadily brighter. A miniature full moon, gliding through the Stygian space. Relief like nothing I've ever experienced sparks and crackles in my muscles as he appears at last just beyond the edge of the clearing. The brilliant headlamp overhanging his eyes illuminates his distinctive Roman nose and the softly captivating curve of his lips. My friend has come to save me. How did you find me out here? I whisper breathlessly, after duly expressing my pleasure to see him. I took the four-wheeler around to the campsite to celebrate your big hike with you. When you weren't there, I came looking. I was worried that... His voice trailed off, as if he's unsure how much to tell me. I think you may have saved my life, Whit. We're not out of the woods yet, he replies, unsmiling. Come on, I left the four-wheeler near the campsite, just on the other side of the valley. He turns and steps back into the shadows beneath the pines, facing due north, directly down the slope of the ridge, on the same trajectory of the path that brought me to this place. Cold dread tightens in my stomach as I recall my earlier descent toward the valley floor that I should have reached miles ago, that seemed to recede deeper and deeper into the apothic chasm below with every step I took. In my relief at being rescued, It hasn't broken through the threshold of my conscious awareness until this moment. That Whit was climbing up the slope, out of that darkness when he found me. "Wait," I called softly, pausing just inside the border of the clearing. Whit turns and faces me, 5 or 6 paces beyond, his head already half a foot lower than mine. The headlamp shines upward into my eyes. "Yui ran off to the south, back up the ridge toward the main trail on the side." I point across the clearing, an edge of fear returning to my voice. "We should go in the same direction and try to find her on the way, like you did me. She's my only family. I can't leave her here alone if there's a chance of catching up. Besides, I think maybe it's safer not to go any deeper into the woods." I don't mention the thing from the pines. "Come back and look for Yui in the morning," he replies, an edge creeping into his voice as well, mirroring my own. "An animal has better odds in these woods at night, without a human around anyway. This is the way we need to go." His tone effectively quells any thought that I might have had at attempting a rebuttal. I begin to follow him. But as soon as I pass between the inky firs at the northern boundary of the clearing, back into the overwhelming density of their shadows, some animal part of me bristles with alarm. I know with the intuition that all hunted things have shared since time immemorial that death is nigh and stalking. "Whit!" I whisper urgently, swinging my flashlight upward to expose the branches above us. He looks back at me, only a few feet away now, just as the flashlight beam passes near his head in its skyward arc. In the split second that it casts its glow over the upper portion of his face, shadowed until now by the angle of his headlamp, I glimpse an unexpected flash of deep vegetal green at eye level. I slowly lower the beam back to his face, and the terror that lodges itself in my throat is too hulking and ancient for a scream to penetrate it. Where Whit's warm mahogany eyes should be are 2 rough gray stones, a patina of moss spreading outward from their centers as if to mimic human irises. Before I can form a conscious intention to move, I am fleeing with every shred of myself from this aberration of stone and flesh, from the horror of this fathomless forest that consumes sound, and perhaps would consume me too. In seconds, I'm across the clearing and clawing at the ferns and deadfall as I hurl myself back up the slope of the ridge, the same hillside that I hiked down 4 hours earlier in the evening. Somehow only takes 45 minutes now to ascend. I'm suddenly back at the main trail, cutting a desperate, adrenaline-fueled dash back toward the trailhead where I left my car. I don't hear anything following me. For a long time, I hear nothing but my own ragged breathing and the rhythmic drumming of my boots against the packed soil. One after another, the landmarks that I pass on the hike out appear and vanish rapidly in reverse order, brushing along the edges of the flashlight's beam like a rewinding VHS tape. All except the first clearing, which I never see again. The forest continues unbroken through the space it occupied just hours ago. With about 2 miles of trail left, I'm approaching the place where Yui first alerted me to an unnatural silence that now shrouds the entire forest. I glimpse a flurry of rapid motion ahead of me. At the outer limit of my flashlight's reach, I nearly stumble an alarm, and an instant later the source of the movement emerges into full view. It's Yui, racing back along the trail towards our car. I call out to her. She slackens her pace to let me catch up with her, and we sprint those final miles side by side. And now we're passing the carved maple sign that marks the trailhead. And now we're passing the old log cabin welcome center, its dark windows gleaming in the moonlight like a beacon. We're crossing the dirt parking lot, where the only vehicle is my dusky umber car, its key still mercifully clipped to my belt loop. And now, At last, we're diving into my car, locking the doors, peeling out of the lot and onto the 40-mile stretch of paved road that lies between us and the outer woodline. Yui and I sit in silence as we speed through the forest, both glancing warily at the opaque shadows between the trees that crowd in close on either side of the road. The only sound is the car's engine and the low rumble of its tires against the old asphalt. The tide of adrenaline in my system starts to ebb, and I regain enough presence of mind to note that Whit's truck wasn't in the parking lot when we left. Perhaps he never came searching for me in these woods tonight after all. Perhaps the thing in the pines cobbled together a first simulacrum of my friend from mist and memories, and the real Whit is safe at home, still wearing his own skin. I begin to let myself hope that maybe, in spite of the impossible horrors I've witnessed here, in the end, nothing has been shattered beyond repair. I reach over and let my hand run gently along Yui's head and neck, scanning her for any signs of injury in the dim glow of the headlights. I notice that the headlights are angled downward, following the slope of the northbound byway as it winds from the elevated trailhead to the countryside below, in altering stretches of graded decline and level roads. A sudden, frigid rush of realization turns my veins to ice. The car has been descending far longer than it should have taken for the stretch of road to level out. Oh God! I breathe into the dark. At the sound of my voice, Yui turns her face away from the passenger side window to look at me. With her mossy, stone eyes.